This is a ridiculous story, isn't it? I mean, why would Jesus even think about feeding them? First of all, why does he think he could? And then if he does, doesn't he know this whole thing, they're going to want to make him king, so why does he do it? But somehow he just feels compassion, and he doesn't even make them sit through a long preaching like the other versions do. He just, right away, he saves that for later. But right away, he just says, well, let's feed them. And his disciples are thinking, yeah, right. You know, we hear there's 5,000 men. I don't know how many women and children there are. Somebody didn't care, or maybe there were too many, or I don't know what happened to them. So, and Jesus says, so let's feed them. And the disciples must think he's crazy. And Andrew has he's crazy enough to say, hey, 5 loaves, 2 fish? And then he backs off, doesn't want to look too crazy. And Jesus says, no, yeah, that's fine. Have them recline, which means we're going to have a feast. They recline for feasts, right? And then Jesus takes the bread and fish and says a blessing, and then he distributes them. Sounds like he did it, all the distributing. That's the miracle. If he did all the work himself, we should hire him at Rock Bottom, huh, David? And so he'd be almost as good as David then. And then they have their fill. And this isn't the kind of satisfied where it's like, oh, that's satisfactory. To use another translation, they were satisfied. This is the kind of satisfied or being filled where you want to loosen your belt. And then there's leftovers. Oh, there it's David. Then there's leftovers. 12 baskets full. 12, get it? 12, a lot. 12 tribes of Israel, a lot. There's 12 baskets full. And it wasn't any word about the multiplication of the loaves. It was just from the 5 loaves, there were these 12 baskets full left over. So I was trying to think, how would I film that in a way that would be very mysterious? It'd be really hard, but I don't know. I still need to think through this more, but like they showed Jesus reaching in a basket. There's 5 loaves, and he gives Vivian one. And then you show again, oh, there's 5 loaves again. And then we look back to see, and then hers is gone, maybe because she's eaten it all already, because like maybe we never see more than 5 loaves. And these are like probably barley loaves, like little, just simple, humble, not very tasty things. And the fish, the 2 little fish, if it matters at this point, I'm told they're like probably be like little sardines, So it's crazy. And now listen carefully for the next minute, because then you won't have to come to church the next 4 Sundays. Because I'm going to give it away the rest of John chapter 6. Remember, in the year of Mark, we spend an interlude of 5 Sundays in John chapter 6. So it gets crazier. They want to carry Jesus off, so he leaves with his closer disciples, and then Jesus walks on the water for some reason, and then the crowd gets the idea that they've left, and they go take the 9 miles around to get there, 9 miles-ish. And it doesn't say like last week's gospel where they beat him there, but they're there. They come at him again, and they say, and Jesus says, I know what you want. You want more food. First, it was they like the healing, so they come to him. Now he feeds them, and now they come back, and it's okay. You want more food, right? And he says, I want you to do the work of God, and they says, which is to believe. And they say, well, how do we believe? Do something, do a sign, as if they hadn't seen enough. And they actually say, what can you do? Like, what other tricks you got up your sleeve? And then it gets really crazy. Eat my flesh, drink my blood, and then we'll return to what happens after that in a few minutes. So this story of bounty is just crazy. It's ridiculous. And Jesus acts ridiculous in it. And get my trusty notes here. And all they want, this crowd, they want more. More healing, more food, more, just more. More signs, more tricks, more miracles. And I was thinking of a song I heard recently. This is a song, talk about ridiculous. It was composed by Stephen Sondheim, sung by Madonna for the movie Dick Tracy. So that's crazy combo. And it's called More. And she sings about how I want more. And then towards the end of the song, she says, now I have it all. Which is really sad because now I don't get the pleasure of getting more anymore. Because I have it all. And does that sound a little familiar? Like, have you ever wanted more of something? More of somebody? More money? And more is never enough, though, is it? There's never going to be enough. People who suffer from addictions painfully are aware of this, right? That more is never going to be enough. I saw this documentary on Amy Winehouse the other day, the singer who tragically died from, she had tons of alcohol in her system. She had trouble with drugs and bulimia and anorexia. And at one point towards the end, she wins a Grammy, and she's back in the backstage with her friend. And her friend says, "What's wrong?" Amy Winehouse says, "It's so boring without being high." Like, she just won a Grammy, you know? So we want more, and we want more of more things, and yet in this world there's less and less of the necessities. And so then how could it be that Pope Francis is so ridiculous to tell us in his encyclical on the environment that we can do something about climate change, that we can do something about poverty, because poverty infuses this letter, because of course people who are poor suffer the most from climate change, already suffering. How can we be so ridiculous to think we can do anything about climate change, about poverty, about all the ills that are part of poverty, lack of food, lack of education, lack of health care, lack of housing? How do we think we could possibly do something about violence and racism? It's almost as if somebody were to sprout up from the cornfields of Iowa, somebody, say, with a music background, and think she could go to the other side of the world, to a country that especially suffers from all these ills, a beautiful, awesome country that's deeply wounded and deeply impoverished, a country like, say, Burundi, an Iowan like, say, Julie. You know, crazy, ridiculous. Even if it were possible to do things, there's not enough. Not only is there not enough stuff, there's just not enough compassion to go around. You ever heard about compassion fatigue? You know, like, okay, we'll give money for a few weeks after a typhoon, but then there's compassion fatigue, or whatever they call it, something fatigue. And I've preached before, I mentioned before here about the studies that show, you know, if somebody were to show a picture of a starving girl and ask a group of people for money for her, there'd be a pretty good response. But if that same person told the same group about 100 million people that were starving and then asked for money, there'd be less response. And the interpretation of that is, first of all, it wasn't personal, they didn't see a picture. But second of all, and more importantly, that it's just too big, it's too immense to respond. Or maybe we'll respond a little, but, you know, I can help one starving girl, but 100 million, I just don't know where to begin. So then I read an interesting article last week, which takes an interesting look at this. It kind of hits some nuances where, and they say that, it's hard to wrap my mind around this. They say, well, it's true that, you know, if it's abstract and not a particular person, people give less. But if you don't ask for less, if I just stood up here and told you about 100 million starving people, but you were confident I wasn't going to ask you to do anything about it, ask for anything money, then you would feel free to feel compassion because we're safe. We don't have to do anything. We're not going to be so disturbed like, oh, what can I do? And then the other thing is, these people were pointing out in this article I read, compassion is a choice. It's not just, we can't just say, well, we're victims of lack of compassion. We're victims of this weird disease that human beings have of, if it's abstract or if it's too big, we just, sorry, I'm a human being. I can't have compassion. No, we can choose compassion. We're Christians. We look out for one another. And then maybe the feelings will follow, maybe not, but we can choose compassion. Jesus tells that crowd when they're after more, and he says, well, what I want you to do is the work of the Father. And they say, what is it? And he says, the work of the Father is belief. But is there enough belief in that crowd? Because then they say, well, do more, do a sign. What can you do so that we can believe? And they've already seen so much. They've been satisfied. Is there enough belief? And are there enough believers? Because Jesus starts talking crazy talk even more and gets into the part about eat my flesh and drink my blood, and then he turns around and a bunch of people are leaving. And then he turns to the 12, and this is the first time, and one of only 2 times, that phrase is used, the 12, in the Gospel according to John. Otherwise, we don't get a sense of how many, it's no apostles versus disciples, it's just disciples, and we don't know how many there are, and some are named, but we don't get the list of 12 names. And you almost get the feeling like maybe they're the only 12 left. That's so pathetic after thousands were there. But then you remember this number 12, right? 12 means everything. It means all of Israel. It's huge. It's enough anyway. There's 12. Well, here today we're 12 times 12, maybe times 2. For, let's say, the 2 natures of Christ. I don't know. And are we enough? Do we have faith that if we bring out our 5 barley loaves, our tiny little crummy, crusty bit of forgiveness or faith or skills or hope, our 2 smelly little fish, what we think is spoiled hope, are we jaded? But if we bring out that little bit we have that God has, after all, given us, is it possible that God could really make something of that? Our first communicants are hoping that God will do something with that ridiculous little piece of bread. Really little kids, when they come up, they say, oh, I want a cracker. If they even know it's bread, if they're even that close. What is that? That little tasteless piece. A little wine, little cheap wine. If you're feeling bold enough to drink after the person in front of you, can God make something of that for us? Can God satisfy us with that? Do we believe that this is God feeding us with God's very self, with Christ? We do. We're ridiculous. We believe that. And if God can fill us, can satisfy our hearts in this way with the Eucharist, then what more? What more is there? What more could we want?